Hey guys, I thought while I was dug into this module, it might be kind of good to clarify what I said earlier. I think I got the edges wrong on the PIP signal, so I'm going to show you guys live what that's all about. There is a PIP signal coming out of the distributor going to the computer. The computer modifies that PIP signal, sends it back to the ignition module, and they call that modified signal SPOUT. SPOUT is what timing is based on, unless the SPOUT connector is unplugged, in which case PIP is what timing is based on. So here's the signals. The blue signal is the PIP signal. The red signal is coil firing event. That's this first spike right here. And then the green signal is the SPOUT signal. So just taking a hard look at one time, we can see that the coil is being charged. No, let's look at this one instead. The coil is being charged here, the current's being held here, and then the coil fires. And the coil firing lines up exactly with the leading edge of the SPOUT signal. So leading edge of the SPOUT signal determines when the coil is fired. There's a notch in the top of the SPOUT signal. That notch lines up with the PIP signal, right? The falling edge of PIP and SPOUT line up with absolutely nothing. They're meaningless in these older cars. In 94 and up, they actually control the dwell of the coil. But on these older cars, you can see the dwell of the coil lines up with nothing. The module controls the dwell of the coil, and it's not based on the timing of the PIP signals at all. So, once again, the SPOUT signal, the leading edge of the SPOUT signal, is what turns the coil off. What turns the coil on is the ignition module at its own preset time, which I've measured to be about 6 milliseconds before the coil fires. So the coil dwell time is about 6 milliseconds at idle on this car. And now I'm going to go and unplug the SPOUT connector. That puts the motor at 10 degrees of base timing and eliminates the SPOUT signal from controlling the computer. Now the ignition module and the PIP sensor in the distributor completely controls the spark timing. And if you take a look, the leading edge where the coil fires right here, the leading edge lines up with the blue PIP and the green SPOUT. Notice we have a SPOUT signal even though I have completely unplugged the SPOUT connector near the distributor. So that signal is not coming from the computer. That SPOUT signal is coming from the ignition module, and it's duplicating the PIP signal. The PIP and the SPOUT, the blue and the green, are identical, and it's the ignition module faking the SPOUT, or generating the SPOUT signal and making it identical to the PIP signal. The ignition coil runs off of the SPOUT signal, but because the SPOUT and the PIP are identical, you might as well say it runs off the PIP signal. The computer is completely not in control at this point, and the car's ignition timing is fixed at 10 degrees and completely decided by the base timing setting and the ignition module. It's running with no computer adjustment at all, so no matter what we did, if we revved up the timing, it would not change. The timing light would show 10 degrees. So I thought that was kind of interesting to show. I was wrong before. It was not the falling edge, it is the rising edge of PIP and the rising edge of SPOUT that is making the coil fire. Richard Adams, no, I did not buy your bicycle a few years ago. I looked at your white Camaro years ago and I wish I'd bought it. It was a beautiful car. I'm going to plug in, if I can, I'm going to plug in that SPOUT connector again. This is what they look like. It's just one connector, one wire goes into it and back out of it. This thing's just a jumper. So when it's installed, you're just making the SPOUT wire whole. If I can do this with one hand. Alright, so spout's back in. And again, you can see that the coil firing is lining up with the spout signal, not the PIP signal. But notice now the spout is being generated by the computer and it no longer lines up with the PIP signal. The PIP signal is behind the spout signal. So what's happening is the computer is using the last PIP signal to generate the next spout signal. Maybe that's better shown here. Here's the last PIP signal, and the computer's generating the next spout signal earlier than it's actually getting the signal from the distributor on this next round. So the computer is hedging its bets to guess what the difference is in timing right here. When the spout signal is plugged in, the spout connector is plugged in, the spout is in control of timing, the PIP signal is delayed, or the same 10 degrees as always, but the spout signal is sitting around 20 degrees of ignition timing at idle, give or take. It's moving around a little bit and you can actually see that. But the spout signal is now in control, and the notches, I was trying to figure out what these notches are actually representing. The notches in one represent the edge of another. So the leading edge of the PIP signal is creating this delayed notch in the spout signal. The falling edge of the spout signal is creating the notch in the falling edge of the PIP signal. And I think they're just a confirmation. The computer sees that that both signals are having an effect on each other, which is kind of interesting. So the computer is able to sort of keep an eye on whether or not these two signals are interacting, and I suppose it's able to probably throw a ignition diagnostic monitor code that sees something it doesn't like there. So as you can see, the PIP signal is no longer in charge. It is delayed. The spout signal, the leading edge of the spout signal, lines up perfectly with the ignition coil firing event. And just for fun, let's take a look at some of these ignition coil firing events. This is the beauty of a scope. This is why it's important to have one. Mine's kind of a top of the line. It's a Picoscope 4423. Doesn't really get much better than that. The ignition signal, this is 12 volts when the coil is off. This wire is connected to, or this terminal rather, this pin is connected to the coil negative. When the coil is turned on, that 12 volts drops to ground. The computer holds the ground for the dwell time. Then it comes up here and does something tricky. This is called current limiting. This is where the computer raises the ground going up to the coil to a higher voltage than 0. And what it's doing is it's limiting the current in the coil and clipping the coil from having too much runaway amperage. Holds it there a little further, kind of like full power. It's holding it full power right there. And then when it fires, there's this big firing line, and then there's this burn line or spark line. And this is the actual combustion event. This is the spark traveling through the cylinder, and this any weirdness you see in that is like turbulence inside the cylinder. And then the edge of this, where it falls off, is the end of the spark burning. It's done burned out, and that little wave you see right here, that's a coil oscillation. That's whatever power was left over from firing that's no longer being used has to dissipate. And so it just sort of wavers off until it's gone. But you can tell that this coil's got more energy than it actually needs at idle, because there is one of these. If that didn't exist, you would say this coil didn't have enough leftover power. It was all used up. But because there's leftover power here, you can say, yeah, well, this coil definitely has enough go-go juice to fire this thing off at idle. That would be pretty cool to see that at about 6,000 RPMs at wide open throttle. So I think that's it. This is not a follow-up to the module testing. This is just sort of showing you guys how PIP and spout work. And to give you some idea of how fast this is happening, the area from here to here is about 6 thousandths of a second. And the area from the leading edge here all the way to the very tip here is about 10,000ths of a second. So it's a really fast signal, and nothing's going to catch that except for a scope. We can change that signal on the scope and look at it in all kinds of different time bases. I can speed up on it. Here's a really fast version. And it's actually kind of interesting because when you see the faster version happening, you get a little more detail. You notice here that when the coil first fires, there's an oscillation there too that's clear as a bell when you zoom in on it. And there's a little better example of the coil de-oscillating or burning off the excess energy. So the time base has an effect on the clarity because of the number of samples being taken. That's pretty extreme right there. That's 500 microseconds. So every one division on the scope, which is from this line to this line, is a half of a thousandth of a second. Here is where every line is a thousandth of a second. There's 10 lines on the screen, so that's 10,000ths of a second, this entire screen. When we're looking at detail, we want that to be real fast like that. This is a great bit of detail right there. And I can kind of see how the combustion is taking place there by looking at that burn line. That's actually pretty good. I don't see a lot of problems there. You can tell if a car is running super rich or super lean by looking at this burn line. Not on any one shot, but overall. And this one seems to be running pretty okay at the moment. Or we can zoom out and slow the time base down and see more repetition than detail. So now I'm looking at each one of those tenth of a screens is 100 milliseconds. So the entire screen represents 1 second of time. And you can see all the different times the coil fired in 1 second. Looks like, I don't know, a lot, probably 30 or 40. The scope can work in any time base it wants, from slow to ridiculously fast. Here's where each tenth of a section of the screen, about this wide, is 1 second. So you can watch the scope grab a lot of waveforms, which we can later zoom in on and look at great detail. But for now, this captures a ton of them. Or to give you an idea how ridiculously fast the picoscope is, that's 50 microseconds. Let me move the trigger over a little bit so you can see more. It's actually so fast it doesn't even fit on the screen. So here the whole screen represents basically one firing event of the coil, from that left edge on the red trace all the way to the end of the wiggly stuff on the right edge of the red trace. That's the coil that we're looking at. And that really shows some great resolution. You can see in here, if you look really closely, that the coil, the current limiting event, is actually a really fast on-off trigger. I don't know if I can maybe zoom in and show you that. That would be cool. There it is. That's a perfect example. The ignition module is limiting the amperage going to the coil by rapidly switching the ground up and down at a higher elevation. That is, let's see if I can put a number on that of some sort. It's holding the coil at about 9.75 volts on the ground wire out of the 14 or so volts that's going to it. So it's only providing a very partial ground, and that thing's so fast you can actually watch the ignition module do that. That's cool. There's a zoom in of the burn time and the coil oscillations afterwards. You want to see a pretty nice flat line, and this one does that. There's not anything funky happening in the combustion chamber here, or that line would be a lot different shaped. If it's misfiring or something, this line would oscillate up and down radically. These coil oscillations tell you there's a whole lot of power to begin with there, and then these coil oscillations at the end tell you that there's still some left when it's all done. The depth at which this goes down tells you the amount of ground this thing's capable of, to a level somewhere right about there. That's trace B, so 164 millivolts is about the ground level of this coil when the computer pulls it to ground. That's a good ground. And the high side of that, up here, is the voltage at the coil before it's grounded. It's about 12.8 or so. There is a little bit of a voltage drop on these older cars between alternator voltage and actual coil power voltage, but that's okay. Old car, old wiring. There's a little more repetition so we can look at 4 cylinders at a time. And again, the point of this video was just to show that with the coil firing event, when the coil's turned off is when it fires the spark, and that line is the left edge of that tall rise in the red trace there, and that coil firing event lines up perfectly with the rising edge of the spout connector. And if you unplug the spout connector, it lines up with the rising edge of the PIP signal, the blue trace. Spout's green. That's it, guys. Enough horsing around for one day. I apologize for the prior video that it got cut off short because my phone was dying, and I wasn't even sure if it was filming at some point, so I just let it go. But this car is solved. The new Motorcraft ignition module is bad. Altogether, the things that have been replaced on this car that were majorly wrong with it when I got it, it came in for an idling problem. That turned out to be a problem with the capacitors inside the computer, so we had it rebuilt. The throttle position sensor, because it was an aftermarket junk one, so we replaced it. I also cleaned the throttle body, which probably contributed, but that wasn't the problem. The ignition module was the cause of the car stalling randomly when you drive it around every 20 minutes or so. The new ignition module is just bad out of the box. That's what causes it to stall every time the module is cold, so I'll be replacing that yet again. Sad, because that's a new Motorcraft module. And then the other problem that we had with the car was at some point it lost injector pulse on cylinder number 3, and we traced that down to be a broken finger that retains the terminal at the computer for that injector wire. So I had to go modify the computer harness connector at the computer end to fix that terminal that was pushing out. Not all these problems required a scope, but honestly the scope was key to this, because most of these signals, they happen so fast that unless you have a scope to slow it down, you'll never see that happening. And if you're replacing an ignition module without looking at this type of data, you're guessing, or you're using ruling things out, process of elimination. There's nothing that can do what a scope does. And I'm constantly amazed, to be honest, that a lot of mechanics don't have one or don't know how to use one. And I know some of them can't afford one, they're pretty expensive, but there's nothing else that can go fast enough to watch a cylinder fire as if it's in slow motion. It's just an unbeatable tool for that, and the quality of the scope makes a big difference too. You can't use a $500 scope and expect results like this. This is literally the finest scope money can buy, I think, for automotive use, and the speed at which it does things is just staggering. I can make this thing, and I'll do it now, I can make this thing go so fast that the lines just get crazy on the screen, and it's keeping up with that. So what the scope really is a very fast voltmeter. Where a voltmeter updates its display about 4 times per second, the scope updates this display ridiculously fast. So give you an idea, that upper left corner, you see this box where it says 2 milliseconds per division. Each screen has 10 divisions represented by this blue dotted line. There's 10 of these blue dotted lines across the screen. So 1 millisecond is 1,000th of 1 second per each division, meaning that the whole screen right now is 10,000ths of a second. And if we go down, that's 500 microseconds, 200 microseconds, 100 microseconds, 50 microseconds, 20 microseconds, 10, 5, 2, 1. 1 microsecond. And notice how ridiculously fast that red line is now moving on the scope, so fast you really can't make any use out of it. That's 1/1,000th of a second. Each one of these, between these two blue dotted lines on the screen here, there's 10 of those divisions. Between each division is 1/1,000,000th of a second. And that's how fast this thing can go. So actually it can go faster. I don't know if we'll even see anything on the screen. There's 500 nanoseconds. That's 1/2,000,000th of a second per division. And that's it. That's the that's the fastest the scope goes. But see how crazy fast the signal on the screen is getting at that point. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Speeding it back up so that we can capture the entire thing on the screen again. That's a much more useful image. That's 2 milliseconds per division. And so there's 10 divisions, so that's 20,000th of a second for each full screen here. And that's about right for most automotive things. Somewhere between 2 and 50 milliseconds per division is the normal speed that we would use to see a running engine. And if you want to see repetition, we go slower. There's 20 milliseconds per division, and now I can see several signals. Let's see if I can capture this on screen. The PIP signal is this blue signal coming out of the distributor. The distributor has 8 PIP signals for every 1 revolution of the distributor, or 4 PIP signals for every 1 revolution of the crankshaft. So I'm watching the distributor spin around 1 time. Oh man, there it is too. It just stalled. That's the problem with the module that's intermittent, that keeps popping in and out. Anyhow, it's actually easier to see this now that it's shut. The rising edge of this signal here, or actually the entire signal, this is what they call signature PIP. If you look up close, that represents cylinder number 1. It does not have the notches in it, and it's skinnier than the rest. It's about a 33% duty cycle. The other ones, like these, that's a full 50% duty cycle, where it's called just a regular PIP signal. And that's basically, when I say 50% duty cycle, that means it's turned on for half of a cycle and turned off for a half of a cycle evenly. So this is 1 PIP cycle, and 50% of it's on, 50% of it's off. That means that the window in the reluctor in the distributor, that window is exactly as big as the tooth next to the window. So when the tooth appears, it's on as much as when the tooth isn't there, the window is off. So the window and the tooth are the same size, except for when you get to signature PIP, and you can see that the tooth in the distributor on the reluctor wheel is narrower, representing top dead center on cylinder number 1. And it's like a 33% duty cycle or 35, somewhere right in there. So the tooth is narrower, which means the on time here is less and the off time is more. And the computer monitors these PIP signals, and it watches it like this. The computer sees PIP, 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 and then it gets to signature PIP, and it goes, aha, that's cylinder number 1 firing, and then it resumes PIP, 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 and the computer's counting from 0 to 8, from 1 to 8, starting with 1 at the signature PIP. It counts all the way up to 8 and repeats back to 1 again and starts over. So the computer knows which cylinder you're on by just knowing which one of these is number 1 TDC, and then it can count in the firing order what the other 7 are. So that's kind of how the PIP and spout signals work on these old TFI cars. Mustangs, pretty much any Ford from 95 and back is going to be a TFI ignition as long as it's computer controlled. So 86 to 95 is generally the window. The 94 and 95 cars, the PIP and spout signals are a little bit different, and the computer actually controls the dwell on those cars. In these cars, you can see if I bring a trace over here and line up with when the coil is turned on is right here, and you can see it doesn't line up with anything in the green or blue traces. So the ignition module is controlling when the coil turns on, and then the PIP or spout signal controls when the coil turns off and actually fires. Alright guys, my phone's dying again, so that's it for now.